My talk is entitled, Is Feminism Relevant to the New Millennium? And if you listen to the voices of the many powerful women now in the public domain, writers, publishers and politicians, the answer to this question would seem to be a relatively straightforward yes. Surprisingly, paradoxically perhaps, since we're in times when more women than ever are reaching positions of social and political power, a time when you might perhaps have expected to see feminism dismissed or downgraded, the opposite seems to be true as we approach the end of the last millennium. As we prepare for the new one, there's been a renewed insistence that feminism remains as relevant as ever, since female oppression is much the same now as it ever was. Recently, I told a well-known, highly paid novelist the subtitle of my new book, which is also the title of this talk, Is Feminism Relevant to the New Millennium? Of course it is, she said, without missing a beat. We still don't have equal pay, do we? Everywhere, powerful women repeat this mantra. Nothing has really changed. Only this week, Germaine Greer has published a back-to-basics book called The Whole Woman, insisting that women are still sexually subjugated, reflecting their continued social subordination. Influential feminists insist that because there are still many areas of injustice or unfairness, there's still an overarching system of sexual injustice, with men always advantaged and women always disadvantaged. But is this really true in any simple way anymore? Of course, women still suffer many injustices, discriminations, and sometimes even outrages. But does that really add up to a coherent picture of male advantage and female disadvantage, which the old feminist politics used to paint? It's been difficult for me to even get to the point of asking this question. I've taken much longer than I intended to write this book, and I suspect it was because for a long time I didn't quite dare admit that that was the question I was asking. Feminism is still a subject which provokes passion, and it has to be said, sometimes unreason. Are you for it or against it, is a common question. But issuing such challenges is unhelpful, because it stands in the way of understanding what feminism has actually achieved, what has changed, and what role gender does now play. It's also preventing us asking an even more fundamental question: do we really need feminism at all? It feels a bit like casting myself adrift from a culture and betraying friendships which have formed me to ask this question. When I encountered feminism in the 70s, it made sense of my own experience, both emotionally, of growing up in a father-dominated household, and socially, of emerging, highly educated from university, and still facing ancient prejudices and discriminations in the job market. However unpopular it was then, and it was, I nevertheless immediately spotted its relevance to my life. And having espoused this doctrine, it was exhilarating to be involved in the astonishing changes it made to relationships between the sexes, to transforming cultural prejudices against women, and to opening up opportunities for women probably forevermore. But recently, feminism has felt much more like an intellectual constraint, which draws me into interpretations of the world with which I no longer fully agree. Throughout the 90s, I've become convinced that the picture feminism paints of male advantage and female disadvantage no longer rings true. Of course, there are many social practices and attitudes, as I say, which still do discriminate against women. Take any area, and you'll find that men still dominate the areas that I come into contact with in my daily life, in journalism, the media, academia, and politics. Men remain more interested in each other and each other's interests than they do in women. And that works as a sort of unconscious marginalisation of women. Feminists long ago identified this as the factor which tended to create obstacles for women in business. But while this is galling, it doesn't quite add up to the coherent picture of disadvantage anymore. In almost all the fields I've mentioned, women have been making rapid advances. In journalism, there are now many highly successful women, including even a woman editor of a national daily. In some areas of the media, it's a positive advantage to be young and female. In the media now, it would be misleading to suggest that discrimination against women as being less competent in general than men is a major determining factor. Discrimination perhaps against older women or women from ethnic minorities, but not discrimination against all women across the board. Instead, it might be more relevant to look at the media in terms of the dominance of particular classes and ethnic groups, sometimes even families. Gender discrimination has now become one of many more diffuse factors, not one with overarching fundamental consequences. Anyone who challenges the idea that gender is not as significant as it was before, gender does not have the same significance as it used to, will know that this can be quite difficult. Feminists often insist that the feelings I describe of being constrained by a feminist ideology are illusory. They say that there's no longer a recognizable feminist political movement, so there can be no baseline ideology, only a loose alliance of individuals with numerous different viewpoints and critical stances. But this has become a convenient mythology whose function is to avoid really addressing whether the old feminist truths stand up to the new reality. When anyone challenges those old feminist truths, it becomes clear that there are boundaries. Take the reception of Katie Royf's book, The Morning After. This was savaged in the British press as naive and misguided for its critique of campus political correctness. The book was naive, but surely not heretical. Her questioning of the appropriateness of positive discrimination and anti-sexist legislation on a sexually egalitarian campus seemed at least valid questions, and the hostility she met seemed to expose that she had crossed an invisible divide, a divide created by feminism's insistence that the structural power of men continues to cross all practices and is a fundamental truth of society. Yet in the late 80s and 90s, it was precisely this truth which seemed implausible, as evidence of changing sex roles became increasingly visible. When I expressed reservations about some of the feminist ways of viewing society by raising issues about male vulnerability and male crisis, I too became aware of those invisible boundaries. The result of all this is that over the last few years, I've become increasingly uneasy about calling myself a feminist, because to say so seemed to commit me to a view of society, of how power is distributed and what gender implies, which no longer seems up to the job. This dilemma was summed up for me. The dilemma created by feeling simultaneously formed by feminism and limited by it was summed up for me during an encounter I had at a recent party. I was witness there to a young man meeting a woman whose entire adult life had been involved in feminist politics, during which she had done much to transform attitudes and improve women's opportunities. The young man asked her belligerently, "Do you really call yourself a feminist still?" "Yes," she answered defensively. "Nothing's changed. I'd still call myself that." "But what on earth does it mean?" he said. "I mean, is there really any need for it? Isn't it just part of the way we are, part of our unconscious?" It was a poignant moment for me because it encapsulated both sides of my relationship to feminism. I greatly respected the woman for what she'd achieved and deplored his attitude to her. But I also agreed with what he said. Somewhere along the line, something remarkable has happened. Individual feminists still meet with resistances and problems, but feminism as a movement has been quite extraordinarily successful. It has sunk into our unconscious. Feminism has been the most dramatically successful social movement this century. It's changed what women can expect from or do with their lives. It's transformed what men expect from sharing their lives with women and how they'll behave towards women. Children growing up now simply take for granted feminism's messages about sexual equality and justice, when only 30 years ago such messages were widely opposed as extremist and threatening to the social order. No other social movement has so rapidly revolutionized such deeply held patterns of behavior. Our contemporary social world and the way the sexes interact in it is radically different from the one in which modern feminism emerged. Many of feminism's original objectives have been met. These range from the possibility of expressing sexual feelings without being castigated, through the principle of equal pay for equal work, right up to the possibility of being financially independent from men. Girls are now growing up in a world different from the one described by feminism. And feminism, as a result, no longer has to be reiterated, but simply breathed. Feminism has, to a considerable degree, got what it wanted, and the period where it came about was actually the 1980s. Yet in feminist mythologies, the 1980s was the most problematic of decades, a decade where they encountered resistance, backlash, hostility. But I would like to argue that it was in that decade that the real transformations came. Jobs opened up to women, career expectations went up dramatically, and most women, including many mothers, began to work. Legal changes and changes in family patterns also made it possible for women to survive financially on their own. The old morality, which had restrained and oppressed women, lifted. Feminists always complain about the cliche of calling the 80s the women's decade, as the media indulged in, but this wasn't entirely fanciful. Rarely a month went by without another first for women. And the decade, which had begun with Margaret Thatcher becoming the first woman Prime Minister, ended with a sense that there were no longer any barriers between a very determined woman and her ambition. With the media also taking up the cause of working mothers and focusing attention on high-achieving women, images of women's potency became commonplace. Feminists through that period, however, believed they were making very little headway. The 80s economic boom had disguised major economic shifts, and the public face of that boom was the young male yuppie, apparently still embodying male economic power. Combined with Thatcher's overt hostility to feminism and her lack of support for women in general, and the overt ideological project of restoring the traditional family, it's easy to see now why so many feminists deluded themselves that nothing was happening. In fact, behind the facade of a buoyant economy, long-term changes, a buoyant economy based on relatively unchanging sexual patterns, long-term changes have been dramatically altering the balance of power between the sexes. The generally agreed term now for what's been happening is the feminization of the economy. What it describes is the fact that although the actual numbers of jobs has remained unchanged since 1970, the types of jobs, the way they're done and who does them has changed. In particular, the ratio of work done by women and done by men has changed. Women's employment has been steadily increasing since the 1970s, when the service sector expanded. It accelerated in the 80s, at the same time as the number of men in full-time employment declined. All in all, since 1970, 2 million men have left the workforce, while at the same time there's been a huge increase in the amount of part-time work, and this has mainly gone to women. These changes in the sexual composition of the workforce were caused by several converging factors, in which the ideological contribution of feminism was actually relatively minor. Feminism certainly made them possible. Equal opportunities legislation meant it was no longer legally possible for employers to exclude women, and feminism broke down social prejudices. This shows up most clearly around attitudes towards working mothers. Until feminist values became established, social disapproval made it extremely difficult for mothers of middle-class families to work. Now, it's women in those families find there's social prejudice against them if they don't. But the real engine of this revolution were deeper economic forces. There was a shift from direct production to an economy based on the finance and service sector, which led to the complete closure of certain types of industry, particularly heavy industry. Some traditional male jobs, like mining and the steel industry, disappeared altogether. And since 1950, 5 million jobs have gone from such industries, from the industries depending on physical strength. On top of these long-term changes, recession and the development of global markets have also played a role. Both have favoured industries which could shift production from base to base and downsize their workforces at speed in order to stay in business. The result was flexibilisation, a shift to a culture of short-term contracts and more part-time work, changes in working patterns which had a profound impact on men. Feminism couldn't have known that the global economy would deliver in quite such unpleasant ways many of its demands. Part-time and flexible working came as a result of brutal economic changes and not, as many feminists had envisaged, through a benevolent process of social relaxation. The economy was demanding the kinds of work that women could provide, even if it in turn did not provide the conditions which made it easy for women to work. Yet in spite of the difficulties of combining work with families, women's position in the economy steadily advanced. Structurally, our family orientations has served us well. We were in a better position to take advantage of these changes, less psychologically invested in the idea of a unilinear career, more interested in flexible and part-time work, and suited often to the kind of jobs which were flourishing with the demise of traditional industry. Now, the response to these changes has been varied, but there are many who play down the implications of these economic changes. The increase, they say, is in poorly paid part-time jobs like retail, catering and services. So feminisation, they say, doesn't mean any increase in women's power. It means simply more poorly paid part-time employees. However, I would like to dispute this argument. In the 80s, it was certainly true that the biggest increase in the numbers of women working was at the lower paid end. But this was no drawing on some reserve army of labour who would be hastily pushed out again in moments of economic prosperity. This was a shift to more women permanently in the labour market. In the 1990s as well, there's also been a steady increase of the number of women working full-time, and especially at the higher paid end of the economy. Indeed, it's in that end of the economy that women seem to be making the most advances. And with girls currently outperforming boys at schools and universities, the education gap is also closing so that women are likely to become higher qualified than their male counterparts. In a study of 26-year-olds in 1996, Heather Joshi, an economist, found that, and I quote, "It didn't really matter whether employees were male or female. What mattered a lot was their class background and how well educated they had been, and if they had been unemployed as teenagers. 10 years ago, gender would have been a terrific discriminator. Only 20 years previously, at 26, half of the women had already dropped out of employment." Women's increased role in the economy even means that women have more personal wealth than before. Two-income families, while often necessary to deal with rising costs, now have great advantages over one-income families. But the increase in wealth isn't just about contributing to joint wealth, but also to women's personal wealth. The number of women earning more than their partners has trebled from 1 in 15 in the early 80s to 1 in 5 by the mid-90s. Amongst childless couples with degrees, it's normal for women to provide half the income. In 1996, it was estimated that more than 20% of men have partners who are the main breadwinners, a figure which has tripled over the previous decade. Women have also made inroads into corridors of power. There are more women on boards than ever before, larger numbers of women running businesses. These are the statistics behind the fact that for most educated couples now, sexual equality at all levels of life is simply taken for granted. Although these changes may appear to only affect the higher paid, it doesn't mean they're less significant. They point to the fact that gender is no longer determining employment and social position as it previously did. The old feminist equation that being a woman necessarily entails low income and low status no longer holds true. Maybe not all women are in well-paid full-time jobs, and maybe it's still more usual for women to be in low-paid part-time work, but not all are, and nor do they of necessity have to be. These economic changes have coincided with changes in law and morality, which mean that for the first time in recorded history, women have, at least in theory, the ability to be economically autonomous and could earn the same as their male counterparts. Such developments can't be dismissed just because poor women still tend to be at the bottom of the heap. The feminist assumption has always been that all women, however privileged they may be in class terms or through marriage, always remain vulnerable to the structure of gender in our society, which amounts to a structural discrimination against women. If widowed or divorced or forced to earn their own income in their own right, all women, whatever their advantages, it was argued, would soon encounter the discrimination of a labour market shaped by patriarchy. But it's this linchpin of feminist philosophy which has been seriously shaken. However interpreted, the changes mean that the society originally described by feminism has been transformed. It isn't true anymore to say that because of her gender, a woman will automatically be disadvantaged. And this has actually muddied the old social divisions. In many cases, it's the families with two professional incomes, the offensively termed work-rich households, who have enormous advantages over those where only one partner works, or indeed where both partners are on low incomes. Unemployment, a low-income family, reliance on benefit and single parenthood are much more important in determining an individual's economic status than their gender. Not to mention that other aspects of your life are probably just as important in determining how many opportunities or how much fulfillment is to come your way. Factors like ethnic background, relationship to the cultural and intellectual elite, and the quality of your immediate physical environment are all divisions which now condition life's expectations as much as gender. Of course, I imagine some of you are already thinking this, and certainly there are many socialists who think that these social and class divisions have always existed, and indeed many have often believed that these were always more important than gender. But in the past, evidence of discrimination against women was so compelling and so visible that even the most hardline socialists realised it was churlish to downplay its significance. It was a myth that worked, and I think many feminists actually saw it in that light. The term the patriarchy that we used in the 70s was always a term that had the potential to be exposed as not quite adequate, but it worked. It sufficiently corresponded with a structure of power that ran from family through work and into our individual sexual relationships. But now, these other social divisions and a myriad of new ones often seem more important than gender. Yet perhaps even more compelling as evidence of fundamental change in gender relations is what has been happening to men through the same period. For the changes affecting women's position have intersected with very great changes for men in their working patterns, their family roles, and their social expectations. And many men have found these changes not easy. From the end of the 80s, it's been men in the eye of the storm, not women, including the fact that the job market seems to be discriminating against men. More men than women are losing their jobs, and more male industries were closing down while women's expanded. The new patterns of work seem geared to women, not men. This is not quite levelling, but possibly even reversal, because now men are appearing in a number of categories which in previous years we took to confirm the discrimination against women. 25 years ago, men did better in education, got the higher status jobs, and sometimes even received preferential legal treatment. But through the 90s, it's women in those positions. In the 60s, for instance, feminists pointed to girls' inferior educational performance of social inferiority. By 1996, girls were performing better than boys at all levels of the education system. So if in the 90s, boys have been consistently performing less well at school than girls and having far more problems within the educational system, does it mean that they are internalising messages of inferiority? There are other areas where men have been having difficulties. Men might be more likely to commit crime, but they're also more likely to be its victims, twice as likely as women, in fact, to be victims of violent crime. Young men are particularly vulnerable. 53% of victims of violent street crime are men in their 20s, and boys between 10 and 20 are twice as likely as girls to be attacked. In July 1998, figures confirmed that in the UK, men were more likely to be unemployed than women, to be precise, 50% more likely. This discrepancy is even more remarkable amongst the long-term unemployed. Men make up 70% of those unemployed for more than a year and 80% of those unemployed for more than 2 years. It's probably no coincidence that men are 9 times more likely than women to be homeless and 3 times more likely to commit suicide. All of which suggests that men are experiencing not only external losses, but a sense of internal loss as well. The statistics around the family also cast an odd light on the classic notion of male tyranny. In the past, women railed against their lack of rights in the family, deriving from a time when the patriarch had been able to initiate divorce and retain control over children and property. Now, if the protests of some fathers are to be believed, the opposite has come about. In the 90s, 75% of all divorces were initiated by women, and the majority of these women remained in the home and gained custody of the children. This all adds up to dramatic changes which appear to have put men in the same critical position at the sharp end of change, which was occupied by women 20 years previously, when feminism erupted as the voice of their dissatisfaction. If women were the leading subjects of the 70s, men have become the political problem of the 90s. Endlessly, the media is chewing over the male crisis, their job prospects, their failing family relations, their depressions, and their dilemmas have moved centre stage. And another change has come with that. Men in the 90s are no longer willing to stand aside while women take priority, or to cheer at the sidelines while women run the race to the top. The days of genial masochism are over. In the 70s, men might have shared a sense of themselves as consistently advantaged over women. Now there's a significant sector who believe that women have wrested power from them and have advantages and are taking advantages from the already diminished. The increasingly rancorous men's movement has given a voice to all this, becoming increasingly concerned with what they call the descent of men versus the ascent of women. So how has feminism responded to this different society, where men no longer receive the automatic privileges and no longer feel the old potencies? By deciding it's time to re-examine feminism in this context, by deciding that feminist ideas and policies need a thorough overhauling to see what remains relevant, by facing up to what's going on and trying to understanding it, by sorting out fantasy without preconceptions. By and large, the response has been one of scorn, focusing not on the real changes in their meanings, but finding fault with the public response to these issues. Feminism has spent far more time on disputing the idea that men are in trouble than in trying to understand the implications of contemporary changes or what people are worrying about. They've spent far more time on criticising the moral agenda that now enters into any consideration of the family than trying to understand what is the basis for public fears about these family changes. There's been a collective reluctance to submit the whole area to scrutiny and a refusal to see the talk of crisis as anything other than sexist scaremongering. Instead of accepting the old truths of feminism are due for an overhaul, numerous attempts are being made to breathe life into the old concepts and politics. A common response is, crisis? What crisis? These are not real changes, but misperceptions. Observations about men's changed status are really squeals of male protest at their loss of earlier economic power and prestige. Many writers have grabbed the lifeline thrown by Susan Faludi, who wrote her book Backlash. It's only when gender contrasts appear in ways which seem to question the traditional assumption that men should be the dominant sex that media attention is focused on them, says Lynn Siegel. Attention to boys' underachievement in exams is typical. Educationist Professor Caroline Gipps says it took years to get attention and action around girls' underachievement, but it's been almost instantaneous when it affects boys. Other feminists assert that if there are changes, they're superficial. In Who's Afraid of Feminism, Seeing Through the Backlash, Juliet Mitchell and Anne Oakley argue that these changes are cosmetic. Many feminists argue that these changes are not significant because although there's been a steady increase in women's employment, the majority of women are still in low-status work. And that's Helen Wilkinson in Tomorrow's Women. Natasha Walter in The New Feminism calls on women to remember at all costs the material facts of women's continuing disadvantage. And in similar vein, American Virginia Valian insists that we should focus on the continuing unfairness of women's position. Polly Toynbee summed up this belief that men are still massively advantaged and powerful compared with women when she claimed that for the majority of women, life is as hard a struggle as ever. 20 years after the Equal Pay Act, women still earn 20% less than men. Women are clustered at the bottom of every ladder, if there's any ladder at all. Most women work, but their jobs are not liberating, as part-time carers, caterers, squeezing jobs into unsocial hours to fit in with their families. So, however many women workers there are, these contemporary feminists believe they remain exploited and underpaid. And part-time work shows how much women are being held back from achieving full equality by their domestic obligations, especially if men don't do their bit around the home. Of course, if you do take this issue exclusively from the point of view of economic earnings and political position, making the comparison by way of averages, then these points might seem valid. It is still the case that women's average income is 75% that of men's, that women are still massively absent from senior management, and in spite of Blair's 101 new women MPs, they also remain a minority in formal politics and the most powerful institutions of the country. If you add to this that women still bear the burden of domestic responsibility, that women's freedom of movement is restricted by fear of male violence, and that domestic violence mainly affects women, and that women are still often exposed to dismissive and disparaging attitudes, the suggestion of men losing power to women seems patently absurd. Even women's evident economic gains can be twisted as further evidence of disadvantage. Writers like Walter and Toynbee insist that the increase in women working, given so much is low paid and part-time, and they continue to bear primary domestic responsibility, is merely a double burden. Women are suffering because they want to be equal, but men are unwilling to shift their masculine identity. But behind these reasonable reassertions of the material reality of women's oppression, there's inflexibility and real evasion. Of course, there's no getting around the fact that combining work with primary responsibility for home and children does create strains, terrible strains. But that's neither the end of the story nor the only story. Some of these feminists are refusing to look at data on the economy and gender division, and especially what ordinary people might be feeling about this, in any light which would undermine fundamental beliefs about the multiple disadvantages of women. It reduces all and any protest by men or about men and their current difficulties to being a backlash against having to give up powers. If you are hearing men's cry of pain, said Polly Toynbee, don't listen. There's something contemptuous and insensitive here about what's really worrying people. It shows a failure of understanding that now, much more than disparities of average pay and how much further women can advance, what's actually bothering people are issues about family roles and quality of life. From my point of view, what I see now are that the preoccupying questions are much more about what a father's involvement should be, what roles and role models are available for boys, what's the right way of combining work and family. Much more than with women's position, contemporary concerns amongst the wider public seem to be about renegotiating gender in a new landscape, how to make the right choices about family and work, and with quality of life issues. There is much to do with the state of society and the environment as they are to do with pay differentials between men and women. And nothing shows up this more... I just need to check the time. I'm okay. Nothing shows up more clearly the failings of the old feminism than in this discussion of how women combine work and childcare. It's always been assumed by this feminism that it's only lack of affordable, available childcare which holds women back from working full-time. But in my previous book, Our Treacherous Hearts, I noticed that many women genuinely chose to prioritise home and children and were not just being forced to do so by the labour market. Many decisions were to do with quality of life, where either some women were privileged enough to have a choice or perhaps were prepared to take the risks of economic hardship. Indeed, I think those views have been confirmed when we saw Harriet Harman come a cropper with the new Labour government precisely for assuming the old feminist truth that all women, especially poor single women, poor single mothers, are desperate to get into work. Whatever the precise element in women's decisions, they're clearly complex. And there's a degree of choice for women which up until very recently most men have not considered available to them. But now there's less social prejudice against men staying at home with the children. It's actually not uncommon to see them doing this. But feminists have been remarkably narrow-minded about accepting that the old family structures are changing. Instead, the loudest feminist voice in the family debate has been the continuing complaint about the double burden of childcare and work. The most common statistic wheeled out in this debate is how little time the working father spends with his children and how much of the work still falls to women. Why doesn't man want to do his share, moaned Virginia Valian in her book called Why So Slow? In the workplace, slackers exist, but they're looked down on by others. So this feminism continues to insist that the family is still the same place of subordination and personal restriction that it ever was, even though the economic edifice on which that model was built is now crumbling. Even though in the popular imagination, where people do not have an investment in hanging on to the old feminist belief systems, these changes are seen as real, not illusory. What people are seeing in their families and their relationships now are not the old models of tyrant and slave, but more complex, uncertain, and also potentially promising situations for both men and women. Feminism has been a hugely important social doctrine. Both its aims and much of what it taught us remain relevant. But now it's not facing up to the changes for which it's partly responsible. It continues to peddle a version of gender relations in society, which can have unfortunate consequences, especially if they're used to attack vulnerable men, criticising them for their masculinity and their potency, when in fact they're often the victims of complex social changes. In that respect, it has become an outmoded ideology, increasingly unable to make sense of a new society. When I talk critically about feminism in this way, I'm not suggesting abandoning feminist values. Feminism bequeaths certain aims which will never become irrelevant. Justice and equality between the sexes should always be important in any modern, vibrant democracy. Some of the lessons that feminism taught are equally important. After feminism, for example, there will be no going back on the idea of male domination built on a natural order. Feminism taught us to pay attention to gender division, sex roles, and sexual behaviour, and to realise that that can entail the workings of power. It made it impossible for us ever again to accept as givens those divisions of labour which entail social discrimination. Still more, feminism changed what we value as a society, making the aims of sexual intimacy and equality, equal parenting, and non-hierarchical family relations part of the democratic ideals of any modern society. So as a set of ideals which will always require vigilance, feminism remains as relevant as ever. But feminism is also a victim of its own success. In many instances, it's failed to notice how much society and men have changed in response to its demands. Instead, it's continued to insist that society is as sexually divided as ever, and with much the same effects. But I hope to show that this idea of gender as a monolith, forcing men to one side and women to another, no longer operates in the same way as it did when feminism emerged. The picture now is more complex. Now we have an economy that is in many ways gender blind and has developed in such a way that it has created tremendous upheavals, especially in men's expectations. Feminism has set women on a path that has made them adaptable, possibly even profiteers in this new landscape. Yet feminists often still insist on their continued disadvantages. Men, meanwhile, have found themselves disparaged as potentates, even as their power base crumbles. In short, this is no longer a society in which feminism's old descriptions work. It doesn't have simple gender lines. It has many different occasions, practices, lifestyles, and styles in which gender is a very significant division, but not one which consistently ascribes discrimination or domination to one or other side of that division. Feminism's attitude towards this evolving society has been inconsistent. We've been hostile to men's attempts to change, operated often with double standards, and most especially continued to demand special pleading for women when there are many situations where this is quite simply no longer relevant. The challenge of the next millennium will not be to find a new feminism, but without losing its ideals, to let go of the old one.